Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com, and this is anti-war news for Thursday, December 1st, 2022. So the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, Congress to add 45 billion to the 2023 military budget. So the House and Senate have agreed to increase the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, that's the NDAA, by 45 billion more than President Biden requested. This is according to a report from Politico. So the $45 billion increase was agreed on by the House and the Senate Armed Services Committees, but other details of the bill are still being finalized. So this is the annual military spending bill that they pass every year. And the increase by these two panels, it brings the total bill to 847 billion that they approved. But then when you include other programs that are outside of the jurisdiction of the armed services committees, it goes up to 858 billion. And usually when NDAAs are passed, the media usually gets the final number wrong because there's usually a little added on top. That's about 10 billion. So it's 858 billion is the total. And that's huge. We're approaching a $1 trillion military budget. And this is just the NDAA. There's other ways that the US spends on, the empire that does bring military spending really to over 1 trillion. But this is just the bill that they pass every year. I mean, if you include, the 60 something billion that they've signed off on for Ukraine, that brings the number much higher. So 858 billion, and this is the second year in a row that Biden made a request from Congress, and they increased it, by a lot. For last year's, for the 2022 NDAA, Biden asked for 753 billion, and then Congress turned around and gave him 778 billion. So that was last year, 778. This year's is 858. That's a huge increase year by year. And the Political report said, that where it is right now is that the chairs of the Senate and House Armed Services Committees, they've agreed on the bill, and they handed it off to congressional leadership. There's some other things to iron out in Congress, but they're looking to get this on the floor of the House as soon as next week for a vote. And then if it's passed by the House, then the Senate, and then it will be signed by President Biden into law. So it's not really clear what's going to be included in this yet, because when the House and the Senate work on their versions of the bill, they get all these amendments that these people in Congress try to add in. I mean, like hundreds, maybe even thousands that they try to include, and then they whittle them down, but they still usually include a lot. And really the big one that I've been watching is that they really want to start giving Taiwan military aid to the tune of billions each year. The latest plan that I saw in the Washington Post would give Taiwan 3 billion in military aid annually. And forget Ukraine for a moment because they get the bulk of they just get so much military aid now. But when it comes to the countries that get annual military aid set aside every year, Israel's the top and they have 3.8 billion. And then this would put Taiwan at second. So it's very significant, but it's not clear what the final number for Taiwan is going to be. But I think that they're going to agree on something. And if they can't include it into the NDAA, according to this Washington Post report that came out recently, Congress, the White House are considering asking, well, the White House would have to ask Congress to authorize it as emergency funds. And that's what they've been doing for Ukraine. So that's kind of the attitude here in Washington, is that let's start arming Taiwan like we're arming Ukraine. So that's the big amendment that I'm watching. All right, so the next one here, getting into the Ukraine stuff, the U.S. may dramatically expand training Ukrainian troops. So the U.S. is considering increasing its training of Ukrainian forces. This is according to a CNN report that cited unnamed U.S. officials. It said they're going to dramatically increase it, was the word that they used in this report. And the plan under consideration would aim to train up to 2,500 Ukrainian troops each month at a U.S. base in Germany. So the report said that since Russia invaded, the U.S. has only trained a few thousand Ukrainians to use specific weapon systems. Who knows what the real number is? But the new training program would be more sophisticated than just training them how to use, the HIMARS rocket systems or whatever. And it would include infantry maneuvers and artillery training, like, the kind of battles that they're fighting against Russia right now. And Ukrainians have been receiving similar training in Poland and in the UK. So the British have been training Ukrainians a lot. Um, Over the summer, they started with the goal of training 10,000 Ukrainian troops. And this new training program that the US is considering was requested by Ukraine, and it's still under review by the Biden administration at the moment. If it is approved, the training would likely take place at a US Army base in Grafenwohr, Germany. So now this is just another sign that, the US is planning to support this war, for the long term. I think our, little hope of diplomacy that we had is gone now. It seems like they're just all doubling down on supporting this, even though I think the fractures with Europe are important. So that is something that could change things. The fact that Europe is not happy with the US right now. But the US is also ready. Apparently, they're going to open a command in Germany in 2023, specifically to oversee the US support for Ukraine, the arming and the training, a whole command just dedicated to that. So that shows the attitude again, that this is a war that they're fighting against Russia, just using Ukraine. And also, so we know that the US has been training Ukrainians in Germany, and they're likely doing it in Poland too, elsewhere in Europe. But there's also, according to media reports, this hasn't been confirmed, but it also hasn't been denied, that there's US Special Operations Forces on the ground in Ukraine, and CIA. There's a CIA presence, so they could be doing some training inside Ukraine as well. Okay, so the next one here. The U.S. is pushing its allies to give Ukraine aid to fix its energy infrastructure. So now, in light of this Russian bombardment of Ukraine's energy infrastructure and power grid, which started in October, they need help. It's really a lot of damage has been done. So Blinken, Secretary of State, he was at the NATO summit in Bucharest on Wednesday. I believe that was the final day, so that summit is over. But he said that the U.S. and its allies have agreed to form a group to help repair Ukraine's energy infrastructure. The State Department announced on Tuesday that it would provide Ukraine with $53 million in aid for power grid repairs, as Russian strikes have left millions of Ukrainians without power, water, and heat. And it is very cold in Ukraine right now. So it's a really bad situation. And the situation doesn't seem like it's going to improve anytime soon. Ukrainian energy providers are saying that they're going to have to be dealing with blackouts until at least March. And now, I don't know if that factors in more Russian strikes, because those, they could keep doing this. Ukrainian officials have said that the strikes have damaged about half of the country's energy infrastructure. And so the U.S. has been leading these meetings on military aid for Ukraine, known as the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. And according to the New York Times, the U.S. is looking to set up a similar group to rally countries to give Ukraine more assistance to repair their power grid. So they want to start this. That's what they're expecting. I guess that's what they think Ukraine needs is that much support. And Blinken met with Dmytro Kuleba. He's the Ukrainian foreign minister, and they talked about this. And while the U.S. and NATO are saying that they're, looking to help Ukraine repair its power grid, they're also pursuing policies that will make Russian strikes on energy infrastructure more likely. Because these Russian strikes started in October. They weren't doing this war tactic that is common of, U.S. invasions. That's usually the first thing the U.S. does. Like when they invaded Iraq, they destroyed the country's infrastructure. Russia started doing this in October, and they did it right after the truck bombing of the Kerch Bridge, which connects Crimea to the Russian mainland. So every time we've seen, I remember there was the drone attack in Sevastopol the day or 2 days afterward, huge Russian attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. It seems to be a reaction to the attacks in Crimea. Not saying that they didn't plan on doing it in the first place, or that they didn't plan on doing it anyway. But it definitely seems like there's usually a major reaction. And NATO members have encouraged attacks on Crimea, including the US, and they back Ukraine's goal of retaking the peninsula, which is clearly just a huge red line. I mean, this whole thing's a red line for Russia, obviously, but attacks on Crimea, you could tell Russia's going to really escalate if there's more attacks on Crimea. So that's that's kind of what the U.S. and NATO policy has led to this, and now they're going to be working to repair this power grid. All right, so the next one, NATO members discuss ways to confront China. So this was also at the Bucharest summit in Romania. NATO foreign ministers discussed ways to confront what they called the challenge posed by China, as Blinken is trying to convince alliance members to take a more hawkish stance toward Beijing. So Blinken said, quote, "What we talked about today is working to adapt in concrete ways to meet the challenge," end quote. He said ways that European countries could take action against China is to use export controls to protect sensitive technology. That's something that the U.S. has been really using against China, export controls and other type of economic sanctions and things like that. So NATO, which is a North Atlantic military alliance, they've basically declared that China is a threat. The way that they put it back in a strategy document in June was that China poses systemic challenges to the alliance. Blinken said that he now sees a growing convergence on NATO and the EU view on China, although some European countries are reluctant to go along with the policies that the U.S. is pursuing. So according to the Financial Times, two people that were at the meeting said that Hungary voiced resistance to some of the measures that Blinken was proposing, and that Germany is still less hawkish toward China. And I believe France is also less hawkish, and Italy too. So, the major economies of Europe aren't really too keen to go along with this, although, they are to some extent already. But the UK is really all on board with the US in its push against China. So the Financial Times also reported on Wednesday that NATO held its first dedicated debate on Taiwan back in September. And so it's the first time apparently they got together for an official discussion on Taiwan. And it said that they discussed the threats to the island and how a Chinese attack on Taiwan would impact NATO. And they also discussed how NATO should make China aware of the consequences it would face if it launched military action against Taiwan. So now the North Atlantic Alliance is focusing on a region, in Southeast Asia. Biden said, and just I've just put in a little background here that President Biden did say that the U.S. would intervene militarily if China makes a move on Taiwan. And that breaks from the decades-old policy of strategic ambiguity. He's actually said it about 4 times. In the first 3 times, it was really walked back by the White House. But this last time, it really wasn't. They just said, there's no change in policy. But clearly, there has been. And then Kurt Campbell, who's the top Asia official on the National Security Council, very big China hawk, he said Biden's comments speak for themselves. So that was a shift. And we see this really just in so many different ways how the U.S. is changing its policy toward Taiwan. Okay, so the next one here, this is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute, and they're doing their fundraiser over there. But speaking of ways to provoke Russia to escalate, Latvia's foreign minister said that NATO should not fear Moscow's response to strikes inside of Russia. So this was, again, during this, on the sidelines of this summit in Romania. He said, quote, "We should allow Ukrainians to use weapons to target missile sites or airfields from where those operations are being launched," end quote. And he said allies should not fear escalation from Moscow. And the U.S., so with the weapons that the U.S. has been providing Ukraine, when they sent them the HIMARS rocket systems, which they're currently equipped with missiles that have a range of about 50 miles. So from certain areas in Ukraine, they could strike in Russian territory. They said, don't use these they said they got assurances that Ukraine wouldn't use them to strike inside of Russia. And then we saw officials say that that doesn't apply to Crimea. But anyway, when it comes to Russian proper, or whatever you want to call it, the Russian mainland, um, it seems like they do have this policy, and that's why they're holding off on sending longer range missiles and drones and stuff like that. But as we're seeing, the aid is escalating, so I wouldn't be surprised if Ukraine does get longer range weapons. And there have been a lot of attacks in Belgorod, which is a Russian region that borders Ukraine. Who knows what they're using? I'm not sure what they're using to attack that region. Seems like it's mostly artillery shelling. But yeah, I mean, he's just basically saying, we should. It sounds like he's saying that NATO should encourage them to launch strikes like that inside Russia. All right. So the next one here, this is again from the Libertarian Institute from Will Porter. The U.S. approves heavy weapons sales to NATO hopeful, and that NATO hopeful is Finland. The U.S. government has authorized a flurry of arms sales to European allies in recent weeks, including more than $850 million in advanced missiles and rockets to Finland, which is currently seeking to join NATO. So the latest sale to Finland, which was approved by the State Department on Monday. Again, there's still a long way between when the State Department approves the sale to when it goes through. But with a country like Finland, there's not going to be any objection in Congress. But the deal is for 40 Sidewinder missiles and related guidance units and 48 AGM-154 standoff weapons, which I'm not sure what that is. So the Sidewinder is a versatile short-range air-to-air munition compatible with a variety of different launchers, so it's for their warplanes. And then the AGM-154 is a medium-range glide bomb, and it is of a much newer design. And then the other sale that they approved, I believe it was in November, was for the guided multiple launch rocket systems, and those are missiles or rockets that can be fired from the HIMARS rocket systems that the U.S. has been sending Ukraine, and that deals for $535 million. So it's just another example of how the U.S. is approving all these arms sales for Europe. And he goes through another sale to Belgium for $380 million. Lithuania is looking to buy HIMARS for $495 million, and Switzerland is just, they approved a deal for them worth $700 million. So, big money to be made here for Lloyd Austin's buddies at Raytheon. All right, the next article here is from Jason Ditz. The Pentagon and ISIS confirm that a ISIS leader was killed in Syria. So the Pentagon and a media outlet loyal to the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, that's ISIS, have each confirmed the death of ISIS leader Abu Hassan Hashimi Quraishi. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. But they're saying he's been the leader for the past 10 months. But what does that even really mean now? I mean, ISIS is so splintered. And that's basically what Jason says here, is that it's not clear how much direct responsibility an ISIS leader even has now when it comes to day-to-day operations. They're basically in remote desert areas in Syria and remote mountainous areas of Iraq. They don't have really control any territory. Although there was, I think it was the beginning of this year, when ISIS kind of laid siege to a prison in northeast Syria, and the U.S.-backed Kurds fought them there. And the U.S. also gave them ground support. So, Biden likes to pretend like the U.S. is not at war in the Middle East, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. And recently, a few months back, there was a few U.S. raids against ISIS in Syria and drone strikes, and they just say, oh, it's an ISIS leader, a high-level ISIS figure. I mean, how many of these guys are there? Okay, so the next one here. So the U.S. and Israel have done their attack, the simulation of an attack on Iran. They held joint aerial drills over the Mediterranean Sea and over Israel. And the Israeli military on Wednesday published pictures and details of these joint drills. So according to the Times of Israel, the IDF said that the exercises involved 4 Israeli F-35 fighter jets that joined 4 U.S. F-15s and a U.S. KC-135 135 tanker aircraft, which refueled 2 Israeli F-16s. If you're watching on the video, this is one of the pictures that they put out of the U.S. and Israeli warplanes flying. Let's see here. So while this is an important point, and I feel like maybe I make it too much, but it's not clear. Israel's always threatening to bomb Iranian nuclear facilities, but it's not clear if they have those capabilities. Israel currently relies on aging tankers for mid-air refueling, which are not expected to support the long-distance flight needed to target Iran. So knowing that, and then seeing that they have the U.S. refueling these Israeli F-16s, that's showing something to Iran by doing these drills and then releasing the details publicly. And they came after the head of the IDF visited Washington, and he met with high-level U.S. officials and urged them to step up planning for joint attacks on Iran. And when he came back, he said that the U.S. and Israel are going to significantly expand their joint military activity. So the way that they described what they did, the IDF said that Israel's intelligence directorate conducted a simulation that replicated a campaign against distant countries, and that's clearly a reference to Iran. And then the IDF said, quote, "These exercises are a key component of the two militaries' increasing strategic cooperation in response to shared concerns in the Middle East, particularly those posed by Iran," end quote. So Israeli officials, as always, they've been hyping up the threat of Iran's nuclear program, as well as the U.S., even though the U.S. recently acknowledged that they're not trying to make a nuclear weapon. But this conclusion has not stopped the threats, including from the Biden administration. Robert Malley, who's his official for Iran, is supposed to be a diplomat, said in October that the U.S. would use a military option as a last resort against Iran. And this is something because Israel did exercises like this earlier this year, I think back in May, and there was reports that the U.S. was going to be involved, but then it looks like they weren't, and then they denied that they would be involved with those. And that was when talks, indirect negotiations between the U.S. and Iran were still going on, but now they're dead, and the U.S. keeps sanctioning Iran, expressing support for protesters. There's all sorts of tensions going on, and then they come out and do these drills with Israel, really sending a message. All right, the last news story is a good one. Australia's prime minister tells the U.S. to drop charges against Julian Assange. So this is Anthony Albanese, who is still relatively new. I believe he came in earlier this year. He said that he has personally asked the U.S. government to drop its case against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who is an Australian citizen, which makes his persecution, all the more absurd that he's not even American. So Albanese, he's previously rejected public pressure to push for Assange's release, but he said that he has raised the issue with U.S. officials in recent meetings. He said, quote, "The government will continue to act in a diplomatic way, but can I assure the member that I have raised this personally with representatives of the United States government. My position is clear and has been made clear to the U.S. administration that it is time that this matter be brought to a close," end quote. So he said this to Australia's parliament. And so this is good to see because it comes after that letter from the New York Times and 4 other major European news organizations who worked with WikiLeaks to publish the State Department cables. And they sent a letter this week to the U.S. government saying that publishing is not a crime and that he must be released. The letter acknowledged that Assange's work is in the public interest and is a core part of the daily work of journalists. So with all this pressure and these are very significant things that happened this week when it comes to Assange, I was hoping, during the White House press briefing, maybe a journalist would ask about it, but of course not. So I dropped a line to the Department of Justice because they're the ones that have indicted Assange on espionage for doing journalism, for publishing government secrets and exposing war crimes and torture. That's what it's about. He didn't do anything illegal. I asked him, in light of this letter and what Albanese said, is dropping the charges being considered, or is there even a discussion about it? And they declined to comment, which wasn't a surprise. I was surprised that they got back to me, but I'm going to try to see if I could get a hold of the White House, but they probably won't comment to me, either. So hopefully a journalist in the press corps does their job and asked about this, because, if Assange is extradited and convicted for publishing something that the US government doesn't want, then they could be next. But that is it for the news. We have good viewpoints. We have one from Medea Benjamin from Code Pink and Nicholas J.S. Davies about 8 reasons why now is a good time for a Ukraine ceasefire and peace talks. So that's very good. They're great writers. Ted Snyder about Stoltenberg's provocative pledge on Ukraine's NATO membership. And that's what I went over yesterday. He goes into much more detail. And of course, the background and stuff that he's so good at. And we have one from Lenny Breitman over at his Substack. He's a good writer and covers a lot of foreign policy stuff. And this is about Elaine Luria. She was a congresswoman in Virginia. She represented Norfolk area where there's a lot of military, Navy, shipyards. And she's done. She's leaving. She lost the election. She was a Democrat, but she was very hawkish on China. She was in favor of giving President Biden war powers if China attacked Taiwan. So, like preemptively to authorize Biden to give him the ability to go to war with China if China attacked Taiwan. She wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post about it. There's some Republicans that favor that too, that introduced legislation. I know Rick Scott did. I can't think of anybody else, but that's what kind of person she is. So I would I say that it's good that she's leaving, but I don't really know anything about the Republican that's replacing her. We also linked to one at Responsible Statecraft from James Carden, writing the Ukraine war history as it happens. And it goes over 3 new books dissenting from the orthodoxy on this conflict. And one that he mentions is How the West Brought War to Ukraine by Benjamin Oblo, which was a sponsor of the show for a long time. I just checked before I started recording. The audiobook for his great book is now available on Amazon. And I know, that's how a lot of people, read books these days, is audiobook. I listen to a lot of audiobooks now. And so go buy that, support him. And if you haven't read the book, or even if you have, listen to it. And then we have a spotlight from the great Colonel Douglas McGregor over at the American Conservative. Washington's Carthaginian peace collides with reality. The Biden administration refuses to tell the American people the truth. Ukraine is not winning and will not win this war. So go read that. It's very good. But that's it for me for today. I can't believe it's December, but I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening. Check it out on all YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble. I noticed, I just looked today at Apple, at the what do you call, not iTunes, but the Apple Podcasts, that some people left some good reviews. That's cool. That helps out. So keep doing things like that. I appreciate all the support. I'll talk to you tomorrow.